She was only 22, a princess turned duchess, a bride turned mother. Sophie of Mecklenburg-Schwerin entered history not with power or triumph, but with silence. Married at 19 to secure dynastic bonds, she bore a son who would one day become king. Yet her own crown was never worn. In giving Denmark a future, she surrendered her own life in childbirth. This is the forgotten story of a queen denied her reign, remembered only by the grave she left behind. Born in 1481 in Schwerin, Sophie of Mecklenburg entered the world as the daughter of Duke Magnus II and Duchess Sophie of Pomerania. Her childhood was not the carefree existence of fairy tales, but a carefully measured preparation for the political responsibilities that awaited her. In the courts of northern Germany, every smile, gesture, and word carried weight. A daughter was never simply a daughter. She was an asset, a bridge between dynasties, and a promise of future alliances. From the earliest years, Sophie's education revolved around duty. She learned the languages of neighboring regions, the etiquette required at court, and the lessons of obedience that defined a noblewoman's place. She was taught music, embroidery, and scripture, not only as pastimes, but as symbols of refinement. The weight of her lineage pressed upon her, reminding her that her life would not belong to herself, but to the ambitions of her family. The Mecklenburg court, though not the most powerful in Europe, still held significance in the shifting alliances of the late 15th century. As her brothers were prepared for governance and military service, Sophie's fate was woven into a different fabric, marriage. Her parents' eyes looked outward, seeking a match that would strengthen their dynasty's position. For Sophie, the world beyond Schwerin must have seemed vast and unknowable. Yet she was already a piece on the chessboard of Europe, waiting to be moved. She likely watched older cousins depart in bridal processions, leaving their childhood homes forever, stepping into roles as duchesses and queens in distant lands. She must have known that her turn would come soon. In the candlelit halls of Schwerin, Sophie's presence was quiet yet essential. She carried with her the dignity of her house, even as a young girl. When foreign envoys visited, her very existence was a reminder of the alliances Mecklenburg could offer. For all the silks she wore and prayers she recited, her life was not her own. It was already pledged to politics she could not control. Though history leaves few details of her childhood, we can imagine the sense of inevitability that surrounded her. Sophie of Mecklenburg was not raised for freedom or personal choice. She was raised for destiny, for a marriage that would extend her family's reach, and for children who would embody the hopes of kingdoms. In the north of Germany, under the shadow of looming dynastic struggles, a quiet life was being prepared for sacrifice. At 19, Sophie's life changed forever. She was married to Frederick of Holstein, a man 10 years her senior who would one day become Frederick of Denmark. Their union was not born from affection, but from calculation. For the Dukes of Mecklenburg, the marriage strengthened ties to the Danish realm. For Frederick, it secured influence and reinforced his standing in the complex politics of Scandinavia and northern Germany. For Sophie, marriage meant departure. She left behind Schwerin, her family, and the familiar halls of her childhood. In exchange, she entered a world of expectation. As Frederick's wife, she was not simply a young bride, but a political symbol. Her duty was to embody loyalty, to strengthen her husband's authority, and above all, to bear children who could continue the dynasty. It was a heavy burden for a girl of 19. The role of a duchess demanded public grace and private endurance. Court life was filled with ritual, banquets, ceremonies, negotiations whispered behind closed doors. Sophie, still so young, had to adjust quickly, learning the intricacies of a new court, new customs, and new responsibilities. Theirs was a marriage of necessity, not intimacy. While Frederick's ambitions lay in consolidating his power, Sophie's role was defined by her body and her lineage. A wife was valued not for her voice, but for her womb. For every smile she presented at court, there was the unspoken expectation that she would deliver heirs to secure Frederick's future throne. And yet, within this political arrangement, Sophie still lived as a human being, not only as a duchess. We can imagine her carrying both the loneliness of separation from her homeland and the fragile hope of finding her place in a foreign court. She was a young woman asked to sacrifice personal dreams for dynastic strategy. Her marriage marked the beginning of a brief and fateful chapter. It tied her life to Denmark's future, but it also set her on the path to an early grave. Sophie's marriage to Frederick of Holstein was short-lived, barely 3 years in length. Yet in that span of time, it carried the full weight of dynastic expectation. For a young duchess in the early 1500s, 3 years was not measured by personal fulfillment or happiness, but by her success in fulfilling the role that politics demanded of her. Her marriage was a quiet one, far from the dramatic intrigues that filled other courts. Frederick was a man occupied with the complexities of his position, balancing noble alliances, Danish claims, and the ever-shifting landscape of European politics. Sophie's place was beside him, though her influence was not one of power, but of presence. She embodied stability, the silent assurance of legitimacy through her noble birth. In these years, Sophie carried the burden of expectation with little chance to create her own narrative. While other consorts carved reputations through patronage, diplomacy, or even scandal, Sophie's life remained centered on duty. She was tasked with securing the future through children, anchoring her husband's ambitions with heirs. It was an existence that reduced her to function rather than individuality. Yet even in this short time, the weight of her sacrifice became evident. The court must have observed her youth, her grace, and the quiet way she adapted to her new role. She was a foreign princess, learning to navigate an unfamiliar court, shaping her life around a husband's career and a dynasty's needs. There were no chronicles of her voice, no records of her thoughts. She became, like many women of her time, a figure defined not by her words, but by the alliances she symbolized. 3 years can be a fleeting breath in the sweep of history. For Sophie, they were all she had as a wife and duchess. They offered no time for influence, no space for personal legacy. Instead, they marked the beginning and end of her brief chapter in the dynastic tale of Denmark. Her marriage was a passage, not a story in itself, a quiet duty fulfilled before fate intervened. In 1503, Sophie fulfilled the role expected of her. She gave birth to a son, Christian, who would one day rule as Christian III of Denmark. With this act, she secured her husband's dynastic ambitions and ensured Mecklenburg's bloodline would be tied to Denmark's throne. Yet the joy of motherhood was overshadowed by the mortal risks every woman of her age faced. Childbirth in the early 16th century was a trial of survival. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia, no reliable methods to prevent infection. Even for royalty, who had access to midwives and attendants, the chamber of birth could become a chamber of death. Women entered labor knowing that their lives hung in the balance, and Sophie was no exception. For a 19-year-old bride turned 22-year-old mother, the ordeal must have been overwhelming. She had been trained to present grace at court, but nothing could prepare her for the agony of childbirth. in the flickering candlelight of a keel chamber, she endured the pain that bound all women of her time, noble and common alike. The birth of Christian secured her role as duchess and consort. It was the moment her duty was realized, her sacrifice embodied in a child who would shape Denmark's destiny. Yet her triumph was fragile. Behind the celebratory announcements of a healthy heir lay the shadows of danger. Every contraction, every hour of labor, carried risks that hovered even after the child was born. Sophie's body bore the cost of this duty. Exhaustion and complications left her weakened. Though she gave Denmark a king, she could not reclaim her strength. Her life, like so many women's lives, was balanced against the continuation of dynasties. And in that balance, she was found expendable. The burden of motherhood was not simply emotional. It was physical, fatal, and final. Sophie's story reminds us that behind the grandeur of crowns and titles were women who gambled their lives with each birth. For her, the gamble was lost, even as the kingdom gained a future. History is filled with queens whose names echo through chronicles. But Sophie of Mecklenburg belongs to a different category. The almost queens, women whose lives ended before destiny could deliver its promise. Though her husband Frederick would rise to the Danish throne in 1523 as Frederick III, Sophie was long gone by then, buried 2 decades earlier. She never wore the crown that should have been hers. The tragedy of Sophie's story lies not in violent downfall or betrayal, but in absence. Her title remained Duchess, not Queen, because fate refused her the years needed to claim more. For Frederick, the journey to kingship was one of resilience and political maneuvering. For Sophie, it was a journey cut short before it could begin. Her name rarely appears in Danish records, except as a footnote. The wife who died young, the mother of Christian III. And yet, the crown she never wore casts a shadow over her memory. She embodies a lost possibility, a queen consort who might have shaped courtly culture, diplomacy, or even the Reformation that would soon sweep across Scandinavia. Instead, her role was transferred to others, her absence filled by those who survived her. For the people of her time, Sophie may have been remembered briefly in mourning, her death acknowledged with sorrow. But the machinery of dynastic politics allowed no pause. Frederick remarried, life continued, and the throne that might have been hers was passed to another woman. Sophie became a silent ghost in Denmark's royal story. A crown is more than a piece of gold. It is a symbol of presence, of voice, of agency. Sophie never touched it. She lived and died as a duchess, remembered in the margins of history. And yet, in that silence lies a haunting truth. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are not in what was endured, but in what was denied. Sophie's life is a reminder that forgotten queens are not forgotten because they failed, but because they were never given the chance to succeed. In 1503, only months after bringing a son into the world, Sophie of Mecklenburg's body gave way. Exhaustion, infection, or complications. The records do not tell us precisely which. What is certain is that she died in Kiel. At the age of 22, her life ended in the same chamber where new life had begun. Death in childbirth was a common fate, so common that it rarely made more than a quiet entry in court records. For noble families, the mourning was followed quickly by practical concerns: succession, remarriage, stability. But for Sophie, this was the final chapter. She had fulfilled her duty to dynasty, and then she was gone. Her death illustrates the cruel paradox of noble womanhood. Wealth, status, and attendance could not shield her from the dangers faced by every mother. Even as a duchess, Sophie entered labor with the same risks as a peasant in a village hut. The candlelight may have been softer, the sheets finer, but the outcome was just as fragile. At 22, she had known only duty. Childhood spent preparing for marriage, a teenage wedding to a man chosen for politics, 3 years of service as a consort, and then death in childbirth. Her existence was compressed, her story complete before it had even begun to unfold. Her graven keel became her monument. There were no grand tombs, no legends of her reign, only the silence of stone. She left behind 2 children, but no chance to raise them. Her name survived not through her deeds, but through the lineage she delivered to Denmark at the cost of her life. Death at 22 is a tragedy in any age. For Sophie, it was also erasure. She became one of countless women whose sacrifice was accepted as the price of continuity. Her life was measured by what she gave others, not by what she lived for herself. And so, in the stillness of 1503, Sophie of Mecklenburg passed into the shadows of history. A queen denied her crown, a mother denied her years, a woman denied her future. Frederick of Holstein was left a widower at the age of 32, carrying not only the grief of a lost wife, but the heavy responsibility of fatherhood. Sophie's death left him with 2 children, Christian, still an infant, and Dorothea, who was barely more than a newborn herself. For Frederick, the loss was both personal and political. He had lost the woman who bound Mecklenburg to his ambitions, and he had inherited the fragile lives of 2 heirs who could not yet stand on their own. The court adjusted quickly, as courts always did. Nannies, attendants, and wet nurses stepped in to care for the children. Frederick himself would soon remarry, as was expected of a man in his position. Dynastic needs could not wait for prolonged mourning. Yet the absence of Sophie lingered, shaping the lives of her children in ways that history rarely records. Christian, the infant son she would never see grow, was destined for greatness. But in his earliest years, he grew without the comfort of his mother's arms. The same was true for Dorothea, who entered the world only to lose the woman who had given her life. In the annals of royalty, children often survived without their mothers, but the bond lost at the beginning of life left a silence that no courtly upbringing could fill. Frederick's widowerhood illustrates the cruel cycle of dynastic politics. A wife was mourned, but only briefly, for the demands of alliances and heirs pressed forward. He would marry again and father more children, but Sophie's memory, though dimmed by time, lived on in the faces of Christian and Dorothea. For Sophie, widowhood was not hers to bear. It was the burden of the man she left behind. For Frederick, it meant both sorrow and the reminder that dynastic duty was unforgiving. He carried on, but the 2 small children were living monuments to the young Duchess who had died too soon. Sophie's greatest legacy lived in her son, Christian III of Denmark. Though she never witnessed his life beyond infancy, he would grow to become one of the most consequential monarchs in Danish history. Ascending the throne in 1534, Christian guided Denmark into the Protestant Reformation, severing ties with the Catholic Church and reshaping the kingdom's spiritual and political fabric. The irony is sharp. The woman who gave her life in childbirth never knew the child who would alter the destiny of nations. Sophie's death was the beginning of his story, and his story became her only voice in history. Christian's reign was marked by strength, vision, and religious transformation, qualities historians celebrate. Yet none of it could erase the fact that his life began in tragedy at the cost of his mother's. As king, Christian brought stability after years of civil conflict, strengthening the crown's authority and embedding Protestant values into the structure of the state. His reforms redefined Denmark's identity for centuries to come. Yet behind his achievements lies the haunting shadow of Sophie's sacrifice. Without her, there would have been no Christian III, no Protestant Denmark, no reshaped monarchy. Christian's triumphs cast a new light on his mother's brief life. She may have died as a forgotten duchess, but through him, her bloodline carried the weight of transformation. Her absence became part of his story, an unspoken reminder that his birth was both victory and loss. Every king carries the legacy of his parents, but for Christian III, that legacy was sharpened by grief. His mother's silence became part of Denmark's future, a quiet echo behind the loud changes of his reign. Sophie of Mecklenburg never knew the impact of her sacrifice, but through her son, her forgotten life found its place in history. Unlike queens whose names shine in chronicles, Sophie of Mecklenburg was remembered only in passing. She never wore the crown, never sat in council, never commanded armies or shaped treaties. Her absence from political life meant her memory slipped easily into obscurity. To the chroniclers of her age, she was a note in the margins, her significance reduced to the children she bore. In comparison to other consorts of the era, Sophie left no trail of influence. She did not live long enough to sponsor churches, support artists, or lend her name to political causes. She existed in the fragile space between dynastic necessity and personal erasure. A young duchess who might have been queen, that was her story, and for most, that was all. The tragedy lies in how silence erases. Queens who fell to intrigue or betrayal often became legends. But Sophie, who died quietly in childbirth, was denied even the drama that secures memory. Her life was too short, her role too limited for historians to dwell on. Denmark moved on, Frederick remarried, and Christian grew without her. Still, the very fact that she is remembered at all speaks to her place in the fabric of history. Without Sophie, Christian III would not have existed to lead Denmark into its defining transformation. Her obscurity does not diminish her importance. It only underscores the brutal truth that women's sacrifices were often buried beneath the accomplishments of men. To call her the forgotten queen is not to deny her legacy, but to highlight the injustice of remembrance itself. She was a woman who embodied duty, gave her life for dynasty, and was then left behind by the very history she helped shape. Sophie's story is not of a queen who reigned, but of a queen who might have been, silenced before her crown was ever placed. Sophie of Mecklenburg's life was brief, her death quiet, her legacy fragile. Yet in that silence lies a truth deeper than noise. The story of countless women whose lives were given to dynasty, whose names slipped into obscurity while their sons and husbands carried the glory forward. Her tragedy was not betrayal or execution, but inevitability. She was born to serve her family's alliances, married to secure a throne, and expected to give life at the risk of her own. In the end, she fulfilled her role exactly as society demanded, and paid for it with her life. The silence that surrounds Sophie's memory reflects the silence forced upon many women of her time. History rarely chronicled their struggles, their pain, their endurance. Instead, their lives were measured in heirs produced, alliances secured, and the dynasties they sustained. Sophie was not unique in this fate. But in her story, we see the outline of an age-old pattern. Her legacy rests not in her reign, but in her absence. She was a queen who never ruled, a consort who never wore her crown, a mother who never raised her children. Yet through her son, Denmark changed forever. Through her sacrifice, a kingdom's destiny was reshaped. And though her name faded from the chronicles, her shadow remained, woven into the very fabric of the monarchy she helped to secure. To remember Sophie is to remember the thousands of women like her, noble or common, who bore kingdoms on their bodies, who faced childbirth as a battlefield, and who were erased when their duty was done. Her story is a reminder that history's silences are often the loudest tragedies. Sophie of Mecklenburg's life ended at 22, but her quiet legacy endures. It is not written in the grandeur of power, but in the fragile, haunting truth that crowns are sometimes built on graves.